Order. Okay. This is the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration, and today we are here to discuss, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, study Standing on Guard for Thee, ensuring that Canada's immigration system is secure. Our first two witnesses are Mark P. Slater, Professor, School of Political Studies, University of Ottawa, and by video conference we have Peter Edelman, a lawyer. And we're looking forward to both your presentations. Gentlemen, you have 10 minutes each. And Mark, we're going to start with you.
Thank you. It's Professor Salter, not Slater. That was somebody else. Thank you.
Oh, my apologies.
No,
must be my
no, not at all.
Teachable moment here.
I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation to speak today, and today I'd like to speak about one of the central concerns of this report, and that is visa policy, and in particular the relationship of visa policy to security. Visas, as you know, are one of the primary tools in Canada's immigration management regime. Even though the final decision remains with the border guard at the border, visas are an important way that border decisions are processed. I would argue, and I think that we all agree, that neither security nor liberty can be gained in a zero sum. In zero sum, that they are not separate. We cannot balance security and liberty. We cannot be free without being secure, and we cannot be secure without being free. Those are both goals at the same time. And so the question for me when it comes to visa policy is how can we make the most secure visa system that retains our uniquely Canadian version of liberty? At present, Canada's visa requirements are determined on a country-by-country basis, in which the Ministry of Citizenship, Immigration and Multiculturalism makes an individual country report based on a number of factors: growth, migration figures, the security of the travel documents, fraud, rates of refugee claims, and the like. But these country category visas are blunt instruments. In the words of Minister Kenney, the visa is a very blunt instrument. It undermines Canada's commercial and diplomatic interests. It is a necessary tool to use in a managed immigration system, but you only want to use it as a last resort. To give a clear example of this, I can point to the Czech visa crisis. In March 2009, Canada imposed visa restrictions on Czech Republic nationals because of a large influx of refugee and asylum claims, and a corresponding rise in the number of fraudulent claims and the number of abandoned claims. While a large number of these claimants were Roma, who claimed persecution by the Czech state, and indeed who received asylum when their claims were processed through the IRB, Canada argued that the large influx led to a greater amount of fraud and that a visa needed to be applied. Now, I'd like to note that the proportion of asylum claims did not diminish. It was simply that the number increased. This led to two kinds of turbulence for the Canadian government. First, it has led to a diplomatic perturbation, kerfuffle, tension. I don't know what the appropriate diplomatic language is. It has led to an issue between Canada and the EU because although Canada is free to impose a visa on the Czech Republic, because of the Schengen Accord, is not free to impose a visa back on Canada unless all the EU puts a visa on Canada. This may seem academic. Well, I'm a professor. I suppose all things seem academic to me. But this may seem abstract, except that Canada needs the ratification of the Czech Republic and all EU members for the ratification of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, which is crucial for Canada. The EU is Canada's second largest trade partner after the United States. And this visa issue is in the way of that ratification. Secondly, I would argue that the visa issue puts into question Canada's upholding of its international legal obligations by preemptively restricting the amount of mobility, restricting the ease of mobility for Czech nationals, and thus restricting their ability to claim asylum. I'm happy to answer more questions on that in the period. To repeat, I think that country visas are blunt instruments. But then we need to ask, what are the alternatives? Officials have intimated that there is in the works a, quote, next generation visa program, which will sharpen visas and allow Citizenship and Immigration Canada to reach below the national threshold and make individual assessments based on what we call tombstone data: name, date of birth, place of birth, gender, and biometric data, photographs and fingerprints. Now, first, I would like to know what the plan is, and I hope that you will ask that question also, because it is not clear to me. We have heard hints about it, but I don't know what the shape of it looks like. So I'm going to go on what other countries do and ask the question about how this next generation visa could possibly work. First, Canada will collect data. What will it compare this data to? The two primary ways that, that the United States and Australia use data that they find in this kind of tombstone data and biometric data recovery is to compare it to watch lists or to generate profiles. Both of these policies fail. Neither profiling nor watch listing works as a deterrent, either for terror or for asylum. Let me be clear. The shoe bomber, Richard Reed, fit every criteria of a profile that you would wish. He even had the beard. He was traveling on a passport, brand new, recently applied for. He was traveling on an international flight without luggage. He had no return plans. He was cross-examined for 6 hours the first day, 7 hours the second day. He still got on the plane and managed to light his shoe on fire. That's because the profile system sort of gets you so far, but because he was seen as a British citizen and therefore not of high risk, then that didn't go further. Secondly, Abdul Muttalib, the underwear bomber, was on a watch list and yet still was not apprehended. I'd like to tell you the story of a student of mine, a former student of mine from the American University in Cairo, who had the same name as a terrorist, as a 9/11 terrorist. So, one thing that we know about the 9/11 terrorists is that they are dead, but that did not stop his name from being on the watch list, and so my student was unable to attend the Model United Nations because his name was the same as that of a terrorist. Now, I'm not saying that there's a large number of people, but we need to be very careful about the degree to which we inherit other agencies' intelligence. And you would be sure that as citizens of the same country of Maharashtra, we would be particularly sensitive to this. What we know about the American system for creating their terrorist watch list is that there are thousands of people dedicating to putting names on, and perhaps a dozen dedicated to getting names off the list. And so, Canada, it seems to me, if we're going to use watch lists, has two choices. We adopt somebody else's, in which case we inherit their errors without gaining any of our own security, or we use a private watch list, because some of those are available, but the dynamic with those, such as WorldCheck, is that names go on the list and they never ever come off. Those lists are generated for banks and other kinds of financial institutions that measure risk and not guilt. So it seems that if we use profiling, we are at a risk. If we use watch listing, we have a problem. So I'd like to pose three questions that I hope the committee will answer during its investigations. First, what is the plan for the next generation visa? I feel that I'm involved in this area of public policy. I have no idea. Second, how will it avoid the problems of false positives, false negatives, and the general increased cost? And third, I would hope that the committee will ask when the Government of Canada is going to invest in more science and social science investigation so that we can gain data about the efficiency and efficacy of these border security programs. I know of no government program that is funding right now research into the increased efficiency or efficacy of border security programs. So, my conclusions would be three. First, that without proof that these sharper next-generation visa policies can effectively or efficiently target asylum claimants, potential fraudsters, or terrorists, Canada will lose economic and diplomatic advantage for no increased security. Secondly, the next-generation visa will attempt to preemptively stop asylum claimants without any process of appeal or justification. Third and finally, Canada has no independent, non-governmental policy capacity to evaluate border security strategies. And as such, Canada, since 2002, is reacting in terms of its border strategy rather than acting. And I think that the difference between the Shared Border Accord and the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative demonstrate that clearly. I'd like to thank the committee again for taking visas seriously as part of border security. I think that this is important and understudied. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Salter, for your presentation. Now I'm going to turn over to Peter Edelman for his 10 minutes, Peter.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. As you may know, I'm a criminal defense and immigration refugee lawyer here in Vancouver. J'avais commencé ma carrière en tant qu'étudiant de droit. Je travaillais dans le centre de prévention de l'immigration à Montréal.
I started out my career in the field of law at the Prevention Center in Montreal, and that's really where I first discovered the issues of security in the immigration field. As a person who speaks Spanish, I often work with Hispanic individuals.
Or start with an example of one of my clients from El Salvador. He was a police officer in El Salvador. He was involved in the investigations and ultimate incarceration of dozens, I think over 200 gang members, and was hunted down by the gangs and ultimately had to flee because his country the police couldn't provide protection for him. He came up through the United States, where he was found not to be an asylum seeker because of some technicalities in the law of asylum in the United States, and ultimately has found a home in Canada, although he did not become a protected person here for reasons I won't get into. But it hopes one day to become a police officer here. And I think it's important to understand the situation in El Salvador, and why am I talking about a small country in Central America? The situation in El Salvador, aside from being a corridor for the transit of drugs, which is directly related to our policies of drug prohibition in Canada and the United States and other places, is also currently in a battle with very powerful gangs. And two of those gangs, the Mara Salvatrucha and the 18th Street Gang. Now, the 18th Street Gang refers to a street in Los Angeles, California, in the United States. And the Mara Salvatrucha was also a gang that started in the United States. And why are these powerful forces now overwhelming the authorities and the safety situation in El Salvador? In large part is as a result of policies of removal and deportation, both from Canada and the United States, primarily in the United States, but where we saw gang members being removed back to El Salvador, Honduras, and other countries in Central America. And the citizens like my clients who would arrive here, that would hopefully one day become a police officer here, would be able to stay. Now, we have no indication to say that immigrants or people arriving from other countries have a higher rate of being involved in gangs, but those who are involved in criminality or in other forms of behavior that challenges security, one of the solutions we use is to send them back. Now, the impact on that in other countries is absolutely devastating. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is the fact that that is directly related to Canada's security. And it's directly related to a vision of Canada's security as to whether or not we see our security as creating, or whether we even have the ability or the desire to create a gated community in which we have the illusion of being secure. And in my submission, that's not the vision that Canadians, or that is a long-term vision. I would submit that in the end, security is always going to be a trade-off. And there's always a trade-off with any kind of security. There is no absolute security, and there never will be. And you heard the professor talk about security and liberty. There are obviously other trade-offs as well. This committee has talked a lot about exit controls and whether or not they could increase security in the immigration system. Checkpoints are clearly very powerful security tools. Checkpoints are used in many countries as very powerful security tools, not just limited to borders, but throughout the country. In many countries, there are military checkpoints throughout the national territory, and it's a very powerful security tool. Now, there's obviously a cost associated with that tool. There's a cost in terms of economic costs. There's a cost in terms of time, of inconvenience, the resulting loss of privacy and freedom that comes with those trade-offs. But we shouldn't have any illusions that there's always a trade-off when we're talking about security. And so when we talk about imposing exit controls, or when we talk about removing individuals who pose a danger to Canadians, we have to understand that there are trade-offs. And so I would hope and I would encourage the committee to, when we're considering Canada's short-term security interests and our security interests today, that you also consider what our long-term vision for Canada's security is. What is it that, what kind of world, what kind of Canada do we want our grandchildren to live in? Do we want to have a gated community where we live behind walls in fear of what's on the other side, in fear of letting people pass through the walls, or in the hopes that in some fictional world we might be able to keep all of the bad people outside the walls? I'm going to submit to you that that's not a realistic vision. That many of the security problems or the problems that we have in our society are inside the walls, and that those that we send outside those gates are not going to go away. And they do directly affect Canadians in the sense that our friends, our relatives live in those countries, and our neighbors' friends and relatives live in those countries. And your constituents, and I think that I would imagine that you'd be hard-pressed, even with a small number of members on the committee, to find a single country in the world where you could send a dangerous individual and that there would not be constituents in your ridings that would be affected in terms of their friends and families being put at risk, and that their security would be affected. And ultimately, I would hope, although these are complicated questions, that when we're considering the security of Canada, that we also have a vision for the bigger picture in terms of what the impact and what the long-term vision for a secure Canada looks like. So I'm happy to answer questions, but those would be my remarks in terms of opening remarks. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Peter. You've saved us here 3 minutes almost. So we'll have longer for questions. So the first round of questions will go to my colleague, John Weston.
Merci bien, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And to my colleague from British Columbia, I'm from BC myself. I represent West Vancouver Sunshine Coast Sea to Sky Country. Thank you to both of our witnesses for being here today.
Raise are themes in which everyone in the room invests and cares about with passion. Long-term vision, Peter, certainly the balance between security and freedom. And I think everyone agrees that there are certain people that we don't want to invite to our borders. Certainly, Peter, the notion of gated community is beyond the imagination of our Conservative government, which is issued 500,000 visas last year alone. This year we're at over 500,000, and in 2010 we were at 920,000, a huge increase over the number of visas being issued by the previous Liberal administration. So this is a country that is catering to visitors, to tourists. Certainly we are very keen on foreign investment, and Forbes magazine calls us the best place in the world to invest. In terms of immigration, 250,000 people welcomed to our shores from all over the world. So we're robustly welcoming the world, and the world is coming to our shores. So je pense que ma première question.
My first question then would be for you, Mark. You asked whether we have a plan when it comes to immigration. Well, we're looking at biometrics. We have centralized the process for obtaining intelligence or information in all of our offices abroad. It's possible to process applications anywhere, wherever the application starts. Are these things that you would encourage to protect Canadian safety? Do you have any other ideas to protect us?
Merci, je vais répondre.
Thank you. I'll be responding in English, if I may, because I think I'll be more specific or more precise in English in this area.
My colleague, Benjamin Muller, will be here, I believe, on Wednesday, and he is far better equipped to talk about biometrics than I, and so I will leave that question for him. But on the question of centralization of information, we are in a challenging time in that many of the countries that provide the breeder documents that we base our intelligence analysis on do not have robust document infrastructure. So, for example, in the United States alone, there are over 300 kinds of identity documents, just in the United States, which has a very robust government. But when we go to places like India or Indonesia or Malaysia, then those breeder documents can be extremely insecure. And so my concern is that we mistake personal interaction for automatic risk assessment. If that makes sense, it seems to me that if we use watch lists or profiling to say that it is this set of names or this set of behaviors that sets off a flag, then that seems to give us the impression of increasing our security because we've run a check, but does not, in fact, actually increase security. Does that make sense?
Well, let me interrupt, Mark. I mean, I don't know if you have kids, but there's kids in your life somewhere. You want to protect them from bad people. And if there were a possibility that terrorists would come in, you would be advocating, I'm sure, for ways we would keep out terrorists from our shores. And as a professor in public policy, you must agree that not all our policies are acceptable to all people all the time, and certainly you will be able to cite cases where they fail us, as you have. But you still need policies. You still need concrete, practical ways. And our government is consistently seeking those ways. That's one reason why you're here today, so we can listen to what you have to offer. We've brought in biometrics, and that's coming soon. That's been lauded by people, law enforcement people and others. The centralization of data is another big step forward that enables our very professional immigration personnel around the world to share information.
Yeah.
We're working as appropriately as we can with the United States and other allies on intelligence services to keep out the terrorists.
Yeah.
What would you do to protect your children or your friends' children from people who malevolently seek bad things for that future generation of which you spoke?
I apologize. I have not been clear. I do not. I'm not undermining that attempt. I'm saying specifically that it is my impression that eyes on the file are better than automated risk assessment programs. That it is better to have an individual making a judgment rather than to put in an algorithm. Because it seems to me, if you look at the research on other ways of doing profiling, that there's a room very much like this where border guards get together and the programmers say, what counts as risky? And they say, oh, lawyers coming from Nigeria, they're risky. You say, oh, really? Why? Well, I've had several. So they put, okay, a lawyer from Nigeria. So that goes into the risk profile. And so then the computer raises up a red flag and says, this person is dangerous. Why? Because he fits the profile. So for me, I'm saying specifically, put more eyes on eyes on the ground is a bad metaphor. Put more boots on the ground. That is better than automated risk assessment.
Let me use an extreme illustration to maybe reinforce my... Okay. A person with a gun is typically considered more dangerous than one without, but not all people with guns are dangerous. So we typically profile the gun-carrying person as someone shouldn't get on.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Very brief answer, please.
Profiling has not worked in terrorism cases thus far, and I feel I am anxious to replicate an automated risk assessment program that gives the illusion of security without actual security. And so I think that I'm much more in line with your argument for more security. I just feel that people make better judgments than computers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm taking the next round of questions just so everybody knows. And my question is, the first question is directed to you, Peter. On the broad subject of immigration and security, you may be aware that we're now considering Bill C-43 in the House, which the government contends will lead to the faster deportation of non-citizens who commit serious crimes. On this side of the House, we recognise the need for an efficient and responsive judicial approach to removing serious criminals who are not citizens, and we have made it clear that we are willing to work with the government to make sure our communities are safe and that criminals of all backgrounds cannot abuse our appeal process. That being said, we have some serious concerns with the legislation before the House. We are concerned that it doesn't strike the right balance between rights and security. We are also very concerned that it is concentrating even more arbitrary power in the hands of the minister. As an expert in immigration law, I wonder if you could give your general impression of C-43.
Just on a point of order. I know this is kind of awkward because you're chairing and questioning, but I hope you will try to be as objective as possible.
I will.
You know as well as all of us at this committee know that we will be studying C-43. In fact, as soon as potentially next week, if all things go well, or the week that we come back after Thanksgiving. So I'm not sure why, when we're studying security, that you would be specifically asking about a bill that you know is going to be coming before the committee, and you'll be able to actually potentially invite Mr. Salter or Mr. Edelman back to ask these questions.
When I look at the questions that I have before me, they are related to border security, and that's what we're taking a look at. And it's hard to de-link deportation, the elements in the bill, from what we are studying today. And that is why it's not very specific questions on clause-by-clause or elements of it. These are general questions.
Well, you're in the chair, so I'll leave it just to keep in mind that I will bring this back up. You're asking very specific questions, as you said. You outlined, what do you think of Bill C-43? So we won't need to have these two gentlemen back then for C-43 if you're going to ask some questions about C-43.
I will move on.
Okay.
Okay. Since 2002, Ms. James?
That you're going to move on from that particular question since we are studying it in the coming weeks?
I've heard the point that was made, and I'm moving on.
Okay, thank you. I think that's appropriate.
Yes. I didn't necessarily agree, but as I'm in the chair, it's more awkward to disagree with myself or agree with myself. So, Mike, yes.
Yes, well, again, perhaps you would want to consider, Madam Chair, stepping down, having the other vice chair sit while you're asking questions, so that we don't have this awkward relationship with you when you do ask your questions.
I did check this with the parliamentary secretary at first. I will be proceeding. Yeah. Okay. Since the year 2000, the Auditor General, the number of Auditor Generals have been saying that the problems with who comes into the country and who gets deported is not really with the law, but with the administration of the law. Can you talk at all about the problems in coordination between the Immigration Service and the Canadian Border Services Agency?
In terms of the problems of coordination between the two, in terms of the application of the law, I mean, I suppose I might not be necessarily in the best position. I mean, I can comment on individual cases, and in terms of my experience with respect to individual cases, in terms of the priorities that are given to certain types of individuals or certain classes of individuals and how those removals take place. For the most part, the tools exist in the law to be able to remove individuals that pose a danger to Canada. And in terms of how that law is applied and how it's part of the challenge is that we have very broad sections in the law that can be applied in a varying number of ways. And take Section 34, for example. It's a very, very broad section dealing with the security of Canada. And anybody, including, I mean, Nelson Mandela would be inadmissible if he wasn't an honorary citizen under Section 34. There are judgment calls that are made by individual officers as to who they are going to use Section 34 with. Those choices, in my experience, are not particularly well coordinated in the sense that certain groups may be gone after for varying reasons. But that may not also be a standard across the country, where we see certain groups, people from certain groups targeted in certain parts of the country, not in other parts of the country, or in terms of how those decisions are made, are actually not particularly clear, even to those of us practicing within the area. Okay. So I don't know if that helps in answering your question, but in the sense of the coordination between CIC, I don't know if it's CIC and CBSA, where I know there are some coordinations of coordination challenges between those two organizations as well. I don't know if that's what you were looking for.
Thank you. And the auditors have definitely pointed out those challenges and being very specific that it's more in the problems seem to lie more in the administration rather than the lack of laws or systems we have in place. We've often heard the Minister talking about 5 sensational cases to illustrate the need for tougher rules around deportation. You're an expert who works within this system. How widespread are cases like this, and do you think making policy based solely on exceptional cases makes sense?
Well, for the most part, I would say that these types of cases, part of the situation is that we don't always have the full picture of the cases that we're talking about in terms of why the exact delays happened, what the causes of the different delays were, and what took place, as well as in looking at the overall picture of the person's situation. And so when we're talking about somebody, to give an example, where I've had clients who've been here since the age of 3 months. They were born and raised in Canada. They've lived in Canada their whole lives. But for a decision by a parent or somebody at different points in their lives, they would be Canadian citizens. Those people, when we're talking about their removal, often will be in a situation where they have children, they have families, they're very well established here, and to a certain extent, the reasons for their engagement with the criminal justice system are very much a product of Canadian society, in the sense that these are people who were born and who were not, aside from being born here, essentially were raised within Canadian society. And so their situation is not much different from anybody else who engages in the criminal justice system. So in terms of saying that we're going to be removing these people as a solution to the problem, ultimately we're foisting this problem onto another community. And whether or not that's right in the circumstances is something that we have mechanisms within the Act to look at, in terms of saying, well, let's look at all the factors, let's look at the humanitarian factors that surround the particular case. And so in terms of are there extreme cases where this maybe hasn't worked or where there have been problems? There certainly are, but the question that I would ask with respect to the Minister's examples are, what solutions could there have been had these cases been looked at under the current regime? And under the current Act, there are plenty of mechanisms to have dealt with those issues within those cases, in my submission.
Thank you very much. Carry on, finish off your sentence.
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. Now we're going to be moving on to my colleague, Kostas Menegakis. Oh, sorry. How could I forget my esteemed colleague, Monsieur Lamoureux?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to pick up on the next generation visa that, Mr. Salter, that you make reference to. And in listening to your presentation, you make reference to other countries, and one gets the impression that there might be some validity to watch lists. We're not too sure exactly what that validity really is. And in listening to you, I kind of get the impression that what we really need to be focusing our attention on would be the border control officers, the amount of border control officers, for example, or immigration officers that we have, so that when people are entering into the country, and looking at the possibility of increasing those types of resources, or put more emphasis on that as an issue in regards to making Canadians feel safer, while at the same time hopefully respecting the importance of freedom. And I'm wondering if you could just provide comment on that in terms of as a solution in trying to move forward. Is that really where we should be putting our emphasis? Is more people-type resources at our borders?
Thank you for that question. The developments in the American algorithms for generating watch lists and profiling are seeking more and more data and infringing more and more on the privacy of Americans and indeed all travelers through America. And so my question is, I'm a pragmatist, my question is, what security value added do I get for that loss of privacy? And it is not clear to me, I have not read any study that demonstrates that watch lists have been effective in deterring fraudulent asylum claims, deterring fraudsters, or deterring terrorist attacks. And so I don't know what security I'm gaining for that loss of privacy. For me, I believe that that when individuals are there making a decision on the ground, that they have both a duty of care but also a kind a personal engagement that is superior to a risk calculation. And so if I could just draw a clear parallel. Risk algorithms say either we know very little about you, and that's a problem, we know nothing good about you, and that's a problem, or we know something good about you. And so Canada and other countries like the U.S., like the U.K., like Israel, are trying trusted traveler programs. So they say, we know a lot about you, and so you can go through. Right. That sounds good, but Muhammad Atta would qualify for that program. He traveled all the time. He had valid documents. He was a frequent flyer. And so I don't know what extra security I'm getting for that loss of privacy.
Yeah. because of the limited time, this will likely be my last question, and it's in regards to, again, the watch list. As an academic, do you find that there's enough dialogue on the whole issue and the concept of watch lists? Has there been enough studies done on the issue? Do we maybe read too much importance into watch lists? Can you provide some feedback or comments in regards to what degree do you believe that there has been enough dialogue on the true value of watch lists?
Thank you. I really appreciate that question. In my mind, the development of the Passenger Protect program and the permeability between American and Canadian watch lists has not been engaged in the public enough, and it has not been engaged in the policy realm enough. I think that Maher, without wanting to only speak about exceptional examples, the inability of Maher to get off of the American no-fly list seems indicative of the problems or the dynamics that we have if Canada uses the watch list of another country. Thank you. I think that that's a really important question. Thank you.
You have another 35 seconds.
I'm fine.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And now we'll go over to you, Kostas Menegakis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here with us today. As you know, we are studying security at the moment, and it's something that is obviously very concerning to us as a government, as it is to all Canadians. We want to make sure that the people that walk the streets in our communities, that shop in the places where we shop, that are around our families, our children, our seniors, around us, are people that we know do not pose a threat to society. So there are a few things that we are hoping with their implementation will assist, and I'd like to get your opinion on some of that. So are you familiar with the electronic travel authorization, the ETA, and the entry-exit provisions in the perimeter agreement we've signed to prevent foreign criminals from abusing our generous immigration system? And perhaps you can give me your opinion on whether you believe the ETA is a useful tool that can be used. Well, I'll start with you, Mr. Edelman.
Sorry, whether the electronic...
the ETA, the electronic travel...
sorry, can you just clarify the question? I think ultimately the tools... in terms of the implementation of the tools, I think there are a number of tools that can be quite useful in terms of the implementing border security and whether we implement that security at different points. My suggestion at the beginning, and I would underline my point here, is that I would suggest that the committee and that the government take a long-term vision of security in terms of when we say we're going to keep the bad people out and let the good people in, that what we're ultimately talking about is creating a safe community or a gated community that separates us from the rest of the world, that somehow Canada's going to be safe. That wasn't my question. And the rest of the world is going to be unsafe. And sorry?
Yeah, it wasn't my question, Mr. Edelman. I was just wondering if you had something to say about the ETA, the electronic travel authorization, specifically. Maybe I can move on to my next question.
Sorry, I don't have any...
If that's okay with you.
Okay, no, you can move on. That's fine.
Yeah. I'll direct my next question to you, Mr. Salter. As you may be aware, the electronic travel authorization, with it, the government will be able to know every single time someone enters or exits between Canada and the U.S., even at land crossings. In your opinion, do you think this will help the government crack down on residency fraud and people wanting Canadian status without living here or paying into the system?
Thank you. I think that if the entry and exit control system works, then it will help with residency fraud. But the previous question about whether or not the ETA is whether it's functional, whether it's a good idea, depends upon what you're comparing that information to. And I think that that's my concern, that the two things that you can compare that information to are either abstract risk profiles or specific watch lists, and that we've seen deficiencies in both. So that's my concern. It's not just the generation of the data, but it's what that data will be used for. And then I think that as a student of the case of Maher Arar, I'm also going to be concerned about where that information is going.
You spoke earlier about you would prefer the eyes on the file system versus to electronic information, and I noted that. You also noted that your colleague that's going to be appearing before us later on in the week would be more in line to speak on the specifics of biometrics. But let me ask you a general question about biometrics, which the RCMP, the CBSA, and CSIS have testified before our committee and told us that they see it as a 21st century identification tool. Do you think that biometrics would be an effective tool to prevent fraud and keep security threats out of the country? As a tool for the eyes on the file to have that in addition to what they're doing in their assessment of whether someone should come to the country or not.
I'm excited that my colleague, Professor Muller, is going to come and speak to you on Wednesday. For myself, I would say in the same exact way that the biometrics only put a pin in the isometry between the body, the file, and the story. They don't tell you anything about the character of that person. They don't tell you anything about the history of that person. They just sort of seal in a moment in time that that photo or that fingerprint is associated with that dossier. Mm-hmm. And if that information isn't good, if that information isn't verified by a person, or if it doesn't have any sort of inherent character back in the country of origin, then it is absolutely irrelevant. If I obtain a fraudulent driver's license in the name of Santa Claus, speaking of my 7-year-old, then for all, if that document looks genuine, then biometrics aren't going to do anything other than confirm that I am Santa Claus, which I'm not, just for the record.
I'm pretty sure Santa Claus won't be trying to get into the country illegally. However, let me
think that there's a question about...
Let me ask you this, Mr. Edelman, pretty much the same question to you about biometrics. There are people that have been refused entry into this country for a number of reasons. They happen to have 6 or 7 names. They come back under different names, many as 5 and 6 and 7 times trying to get in. Biometrics would identify them pretty specifically that it's them trying to come back in under a different name. Do you think it's an effective tool to prevent fraud and keep security threats out of our country?
I think biometrics is a tool. It's a tool that we've used for a long time. I mean, a passport photo is a biometric tool. So in the sense of saying that we use biometrics, fingerprints are used commonly in the immigration system as it is now, in the sense that we do use biometrics. I think the question that you're asking is whether imposing a biometric requirement on every person who enters and leaves Canada is a worthwhile security trade-off. And I think that's the much more fundamental question that this committee needs to ask, is that there's an enormous cost, both not just in terms of the economic cost, but in terms of the cost of
you want to finish your thought?
And I think that, sorry, I was just going to say that in terms of the trade-off that will be involved in imposing those requirements. So is it a tool that can be used to solve the problems that you're describing? Undoubtedly it can. Is it worth the trade-off? I think is a different question.
Thank you.
Much. And we'll now move on to you, Sadia.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our 2 witnesses for answering our questions. Both of you referred to a balance. And this notion of balance in the area of security is essential. My question is first for Mr. Edelman. With respect to striking a balance between protecting Canadians' safety and the individual rights of Canadians, I'd like to know what your opinion is on the means in which we should proceed to maintain that balance if we move forward on this security file. What's your opinion on this? How can we proceed?
Je crois que c'est une...
I think that's a good question. And I also think it's a complex question in the sense that many questions arise. People will be affected in various ways, and I think it's an issue that the committee should consider. Who are the individuals? Who will be affected? The stakeholders, in other words. And when I was referring to communities in other countries earlier on, are we taking into consideration of these communities? For instance, let's say you take someone who committed sexual assault here in Canada and was not adequately treated and was sent back to a country like Somalia. What does that mean to potential victims in that country? And does this matter to the government of Canada? And fundamentally, that's a philosophical question. Clearly, the family, the friends, and the personal connections Canadians have with the community in Somalia, all of this matters to them. And to them, safety, security are broader matters that go beyond simply send this person back to their country or solve this problem this way. It's a matter of defining the issue. The same thing applies to detention, biometrics, and other tools we may use. What I would urge you to do is to really look at the fundamental issue, the impact of this, and on whom. If the only thing that matters is the Canadians that live here now, and the situation elsewhere in the world is of no matter to us or does not matter to us, and the issue of Canadians having ease of access to borders, crossings, etc., you will have a variety of answers to these questions depending on all of these factors. The more you focus on security, if you put more into security or safety, you put less elsewhere. It's very hard to answer this question in 3 minutes, and I won't do that. And in fact, I won't insult you by trying to do this and give you this brief overcap of all of these issues when I don't have a brief answer to this. But I can tell you that your premise is interesting in either case, because what you're saying is that it is important to look at the safety issue much more broadly in a more holistic way, considering both our security concerns in our country and also the impact that this issue might have beyond our borders. I'll continue with another question. In your opinion, the current provisions for inadmissibility under the Immigration and Refugee Act, does it filter people that would be involved in war crimes? How can it be changed or amended?
Well,
I believe the way in which the law is drafted today is rather broad. I myself have not seen any cases where a person would be convicted of a war crime or is guilty of a war crime that couldn't be removed. The question is the Act too broad? It has to do with law enforcement, decisions that are made by officers or officials in each case. When we look at how broadly we want to approach this issue and who we want to include, I personally have not seen an example or a situation in which you have a person who's guilty of a war crime who could not be included under the sections that currently exist in the Act. The opposite is not true.
And now we'll go to Ms. James.
Thank you, and thank you both to our two guests that are here today. I just want to direct my first question to Mr. Edelman. You've made a few comments that I'm very concerned about. Just listening to some of your terminology, talking about with regards actually to a question about tougher rules on deportation, you made a comment about pushing the problem onto other communities, or some of our families may be from some of these countries, and I'm not quite sure whether you agree that deportation is necessary or whether you think we should keep the people who are convicted criminals here in this country that are foreign nationals. I just want to ask that question straight up. I'm not fully understanding where you're coming from.
I mean, I work in both the criminal justice system and in the immigration system. And to take an example in the criminal justice system, there have been attempts, and I believe that the Mayor of Toronto recently made comments to this effect,
Actually,
as to whether
I'm sorry, I'm just going to interrupt because I just need to understand. It's really whether you believe that deportation is a necessary tool that Canada must use or whether it's not. It's kind of a very, just a yes or no answer because I have lots of other questions that I need to ask you. Thank you.
In which case, I don't have a yes or no answer for you, if that's what you're...
Actually, I thought you might say that because you were talking about keeping the bad people out and letting the good people into Canada. I think most Canadians across our great country would think that that's a good thing to do. And you seem to put it in a very derogatory way by saying that we're going to turn into a safe community or a gated community from the rest of the world. And I have to tell you that someone who is elected to represent my great riding of Scarborough Centre, that is my first priority, to keep my constituents safe. So if you're implying that a gated community is something to keep bad people out of this country, I'm really not understanding why you think that's a bad thing. But I'm going to direct my next question actually to Professor Salter.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Sorry, can I comment?
I don't think that Ms. James allowed the witness to answer any of her questions, and frankly, I do think that's the point of questioning a witness. If he could just maybe give an answer to what she said, to your discretion.
Madam Chair, there actually wasn't a question to my second part. It was a statement, and I would like to actually ask Professor Salter a question, which I think is very key.
Thank you very much. And I want to remind all committee members that we do have witnesses here, and it's always good, even if it's a brief question, that when we have our time, we do make it into a question as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I actually asked a brief question, and he was absolutely unable to answer yes or no to whether he believes deportation is necessary. So I'm just moving on to the second witness, if I may. Thank you. Professor Salter, hopefully I pronounced it correct. I have my glasses on. I have a particular question. I know that you've indicated that you don't, you do not agree with just watch lists and profiling, and I know that you haven't really wanted to touch on biometrics, but you did mention one particular, actually Mr. Richard Reed, the infamous shoe bomber. Now, with particularly in biometrics, because he was convicted of a crime, biometrics would actually prevent someone like him, the shoe bomber, from coming into Canada at all in the future. Would you agree with that?
Only if the biometrics in the passport are going to be connected to other criminal databases. So does that mean that Canada is going to request integration with the Canadian, with the American, UK, French criminal justice systems? That's
a good question. One of the key aspects of biometrics is being able to compare it against other databases in the world, because obviously we don't maintain all fingerprints here in Canada. So I thank you for that question, so I could clarify that. I noticed you had this, you were not completely satisfied that imposing visas on certain countries is the right way to go.
Yes.
And you were mentioning the Czech Republic, and I actually have some statistics on that. In 2010, Canada actually had only 30 claims coming from the Czech Republic, versus in 2009 we had 2,085 claims. Yes. And the difference between 2,085 and 30 claims was actually imposing a visa restriction on that particular country. Yes. And I just want to mention as well that in 2009, when there was 2,085 claims, people coming to Canada as refugee claimants, 99%. It was actually 99%, but only 10% were actually approved as being legitimate refugees. So I understand that maybe imposing a visa is not the only way to go, but you must certainly agree that in this particular instance, it did satisfy and solve the problem that Canada was faced with. I mean, when we have close to 2,100 people claiming refugee status at a cost to Canadian taxpayers, surely you can agree that the visa restrictions at that particular moment for that country was effective.
Salter.
Thank you. If I understand the way that CIC adjudicated their claims, slightly less than half of the 196 claims that were finalized in 2008 were granted status. That means that it is not a rejection rate of 91%. Rather,
2009 with 2,085 claims.
Maybe we'll let Professor Salter finish his answer, please.
I apologize. My reading of the CIC data indicated of those claims that were retained, the proportion that were accepted as legitimate refugees by the IRB did not change between 2008 and 2009. It was simply a case that the raw numbers were increased.
Thank you very much. Your time is up. Okay, how many minutes do we have? 2 minutes. We have 2 minutes. And over to you, Mr. Opitz. Okay, you've got 2 minutes between you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to take on from Ms. James' point about the Czech Republic. The fact is that while you're pointing to the end result of a claim of only 186 claims actually being adjudicated, the fact is 2,085 people from the Czech Republic applied for refugee status here in Canada. They did so here in Canada. So therefore, they went through this entire process and then decided at the very last minute, mostly because they weren't really true refugees, that they wouldn't have their files or their claims proceed through the process because they knew they would have failed and would have had to gone back to the Czech Republic. The reason I think it's important to point that out is when the visa restrictions were implemented in 2010, as Ms. James points out, only 30 people actually applied for refugee status. Based on your earlier comments that profiling is not a good idea, that we need to move to a process which would see each and every person interviewed, regardless of whether it's for a visa or for anything else, because I think if you think visa applicants should be interviewed, it would have to proceed that everyone else should be interviewed depending on the type of status or seeking in Canada, that I can't quite comprehend how, maybe I need to understand what your meaning of profiling is, because there has to be some profiling that occurs. And to say that those visas were the only way they were confrontational or they didn't like them, the Czech Republic government didn't like them, but no one in Canada complained to me about the fact that we were going to have fewer non-refugees applying for refugee status here in Canada. So I think you need to combine or think a little bit about the fact that you're suggesting that we shouldn't be profiling with the fact that there has to be some data collection, some management, some process in place that shows that if a person meets the following criteria,
can we now give
as
time for
C31,
the answer?
Yeah, sure.
Please.
As C31 indicates that there will be countries of safe origin, therefore you wouldn't have status in terms of being able to apply, at least for an appeal.
Over to you, Mr. Salter.
Thank you. These are rich and complicated questions. I think that it is impossible to determine whether the reason for those individuals withdrawing their claim because their claim was not adjudicated. And so we can make some guesses about why they withdrew their claim, but we cannot know. And so I think that it is. I think that logically it's just incorrect to say those 2,000 people were fraudulent because they withdrew their claim.
Okay, can we just please give Professor Salter a chance to answer?
I just want to put words in my mouth, that's all.
My apologies. And my understanding is that CIC has not discussed countries of safe origin anymore, but rather designated countries in the way that they've adjudicated that. It seems to me that we need to balance the profiling and the rule of law. As I understand Canada's international legal obligations, every individual has a right to leave their country, and every individual has a right to apply for asylum. If the way that Canada runs its asylum policy is to say that we can only apply for asylum once we reach that country, then once we reach Canadian shores, then by preventing those individuals from reaching Canadian shores, then we are, I think, not fulfilling the utmost of our international legal obligations.
Thank you very much. And we're going to suspend for 3 minutes. Before we do that, I want to thank Peter Edelman and also Professor Salter for coming to appear before the committee and responding to our questions.
Thank you.
I'd like to call the meeting back to order. Just a reminder to everyone, this is televised in case any of you were not aware of this. And our next presenter is Salim Mansour. He's a professor of political science at the University of Western Ontario. And Salim, you have 10 minutes to make your presentation, and then you will have time for questions. Not you will have time for questions. The committee will have time to ask you questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And honorable members, many thanks for inviting me to share my thoughts with this Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. I appear before you as a common citizen, deeply apprehensive and concerned about the drift of our country as it changes due to the rate of immigration that is without precedent among any of the advanced liberal democracies of the West. My expertise, or to the extent my expertise is recognized by this committee for which I have been invited to appear before you, is that of a professional academic, a researcher, writer, author, and public intellectual of some recognition in this great country of ours, and I'm proud and humbled to come before you as an unhyphenated Canadian. Let me state right at the outset, before I share with you my perspective on immigration, I support all measures under consideration that modern technology provides for securing our borders, monitoring those who seek to gain entry into Canada, those who arrive here without proper documentation and claim refugee status, and those in legions outside of Canada who want to come here as immigrants. I believe it is a no-brainer to work towards a more secure Canada and to implement smart cards, biometric systems, and other tools available now or will be in the future. I have no doubt on this matter that were we to have the thoughts of our founding fathers inform us, and those remarkable leaders who have come after them, such as Laurier and King, Pearson and Trudeau, Knowles and Douglas, they would remind us that a constitution agreed upon by a free people to provide for, as John M. Macdonald put it, peace, order, and good government, is not a suicide pact. In the small amount of time I have before you, I want to stress upon the first principle behind the immigration policy as it has evolved since the centennial year and presently stand. Needless to remark that Canada is an immigrant country, and our history tells us that we should know it has been immigrants from Europe over the past several centuries that have built this country. On the whole, they built it well, and indeed so well that Canada has come to be an eagerly sought country for people from around the world, as I did. But, and here is the point, at some stage of Canada's historical development since at least 1867, those who built Canada in the early years of its history could have reached an agreement to close the door to immigration. They did not. They believed the strength of the country would be maintained through a judicious policy of accepting new immigrants from Europe. The key point here I want to emphasize, and I have written about this at length in the public media, is they all believe that immigration judiciously and carefully managed, I emphasize managed, in terms of numbers and source of origin of immigrants should be such that the nature of Canada as a liberal democracy is not undermined. It is numbers, and the nature of numbers that matter, and given the nature of things, determines how existing arrangements are secured or undermined. Since the open-door immigration policy was instituted around the time of Canada's centennial year, the nature of immigration into Canada started to change from what had been the pattern since before 1867 to around 1960. During the past 50 years, immigration from outside of Europe, from what is generally designated the Third World, has rapidly increased in proportion to those immigrants originating in Europe. Furthermore, given the revolution in transportation with the introduction of wide-body transcontinental jetliner that has made mass travel economical and easy, the distinction between immigrant and migrant workers has been eliminated. This means, and it is not simply in reference to ethnicity, that Canada is rapidly changing culturally in ways a political elite, media elite, and academic elite do not want to discuss. But the fact that this is not discussed or driven under the carpet does not mean the public is not keenly aware of how much the country has changed in great measure in a relatively short period. And if this pattern continues for another few decades, there is the likelihood that Canada will have changed irrevocably and not necessarily for the better in terms of its political tradition as a liberal democracy. So, in terms of first principle, we need a governing institution and those individuals we as Canadians send to represent us to boldly re-examine our existing immigration policy and rethink it in terms of what it represents and how it will affect the well-being of Canada in the years to come. I do not need to remind you that any set of policy, however benign or good the intent is, behind the making of such policy is riddled with unintended consequences. History is a paradox. What you intend is not how things turn out in the long run, and not even in the short term. Pick any example you want and think it through and see for yourself the paradoxical nature of history and how it surprises us by confounding our expectations. I have at hand the recent publication of Statistics Canada, Projection of the Diversity of the Canadian Population, 2006 to 2031. In other words, this projection affects me and what remains of my life, but more importantly affects my children, my students, my friends and neighbors. Your views as our representatives are critical and will affect all of us. And you will be responsible in terms of history if you take your place in these hallowed halls with the seriousness it demands for the good and the bad that come out of your decisions. Let me quickly, time permitting, point from this Statistics Canada publication the following. 1. Given the nature of our immigration policy, since 1960, the foreign-born population is growing about 4 times faster than the rest of the population. Consequently, in 2031, there will be between 9.8 million and 12.5 million foreign-born persons compared to 6.5 million in 2006, and the corresponding number in 1981 was 3.8 million. According to Statistics Canada projection, the population estimated for 2031 will be around 45 million, with 32%, around 14.5 million people will be foreign-born. 3. One more interesting and yet critical figure is the cultural religious makeup of Canada in 2031. The fastest growth, according to the report, is the Muslim population, quote-unquote, with its numbers tripling during this period. This increase is mainly due to 2 factors, the composition of immigration and higher fertility than for other groups. The figures are for Muslims in 2006 at around 900,000, constituting 2.7% of the population, and rising to 2031 around 3.3 million, constituting 7.3% of the population. If the levels of immigration in Canada is being maintained and defended on the basis of the needs to deal with the problems of Canadian society in terms of aging population, fertility rates among Canadian women, skilled labor management requirement, and maintaining a growth level for the population consistent with the growth of the economy, then this policy needs to be reevaluated. We cannot fix the social problems of the Canadian society by an open immigration policy that adds to the numbers at a rate that puts into question the absorptive capacity of the country not only in economic terms, but also, if not more importantly, in cultural and social terms, and what this does to our political arrangement as a liberal democracy. The flow of immigration into Canada from around the world, and in particular the flow from Muslim countries, means a pouring in of numbers into a liberal society of people from cultures at best non-liberal. But we know through our studies and observation that the illiberal mix of cultures poses one of the greatest dilemmas and an unprecedented challenge to liberal societies such as ours, when there is no demand placed on immigrants any longer to assimilate into the founding liberal values of the country to which they have immigrated to, and instead, by a misguided and thoroughly wrong-headed policy of multiculturalism, encourage the opposite. It is no wonder that recently the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the British Prime Minister David Cameron, among other European leaders, and a growing body of intellectuals have spoken out in public against multiculturalism and the need to push it back, even repeal it. I have written a book on the wrong-headed policy of multiculturalism and published recently under the title Delectable Lie, a Liberal Repudiation of Multiculturalism. Time forbids me to discuss this matter in any length, but I would like to leave the following paradox with you. We may want to continue with the level of immigration into Canada annually that is about the same as it is at present. We cannot, however, continue with such an inflow of immigrants under the present arrangement of the official policy of multiculturalism based on the premise all cultures are equal, when this is untrue, and that this policy is a severe, perhaps even a lethal test for liberal democracy such as ours. This means we cannot simultaneously continue with both the existing level of immigration and official multiculturalism, and must choose one or the other for the preservation of our liberal democratic traditions. If we persist, we will severely undermine a liberal democracy or what remains of it, compromise the foundation of individual freedom by accommodating group rights, and bequeath to our children and unborn generation a political situation fraught with explosive potential for ethnic violence, the sort of which we have seen in Europe, in the riots in the banlieue or suburbs of Paris and other metropolitan centers. In conclusion, I want to emphasize we need to consider lowering the number of immigrants entering into Canada until we've had a serious debate among Canadians on this matter. We should not allow bureaucratic inertia determining not only the policy, but the existing level of immigrant numbers and source within origin that Canada brings in annually. We have the precedent of how we selectively closed immigration from the Soviet bloc countries during the Cold War years, and we need to consider doing the same in terms of immigration from Muslim countries for a period of time, given how disruptive the cultural baggage of illiberal values is brought in as a result. We are, in other words, stoking the fuel of much unrest in our country, as we have witnessed of late in Europe. And lest any member wants to instruct me that my views are in any way politically incorrect or worse, I would like members to note that I come before you as a practicing Muslim who know out of experience from the inside how volatile, how disruptive, how violent, how misogynistic is the culture of Islam today and has been during my lifetime, and how it greatly threatens our liberal democracy that I cherish, since I know what is its opposite. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And we are going to go to, are we going to you?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. I will share my time with my colleague Rick Deister. I'll let Rick ask the first question.
I thought that's what I heard. So we will start with Mr. Dijkstra and then go over to Mr. Lam.
Mr. Manzoor, we had a bit of an issue in our last committee meeting where there was discussion around an individual's views pertaining to those who should or should not come to the country. And 3 times during your presentation, you raised the issue of you think we should not be allowing any more Muslims to come to this country, number 1. And number 2, you've indicated that we should be lowering the number of those that we allow into the country. So I'm assuming that your basis of belief in the first part, which is to restrict individuals from coming to this country because of their belief or because of their upbringing or because of their culture or their lifestyle, that by lowering the number we would actually have the ability to do that?
Well, I believe the numbers that we have, and because of the limitation of time, I was not getting into numbers here, but I understand it's somewhere around about 300,000 if we take in the question of those who are coming in as legal immigrants that have gone through the process, including refugee claimants, including
it's about 250,000, but continue.
So that's the number. And what I'm suggesting, that is not only such unprecedented numbers, and that raises the whole problem of absorptive capacity, and the absorptive capacity has not only to do with economic situation, particularly in the time period that we're living since 2008, but in the larger question of what it means for our country to remain a liberal democracy. This is a question, I believe, through my study, that we have to confront as the Europeans are confronting today. We are only just a few years behind what is happening in Europe right now. That's the concern from which I'm speaking to you, sir.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, your view of a liberal democracy was represented by 6 liberal prime ministers. I'm assuming you didn't mean liberalism in that effect. You meant liberalism in terms of our rights and responsibilities and obligations as Canadians. Just one further then, I just would like you to clarify for me why you believe that from a Muslim faith perspective, that they're going to have or going to be a detriment to our liberal Canadian democracy here in Canada, or at least the structure upon which you frame the term liberal.
Well, it is, as I understand it, as a practicing Muslim and coming from a background that is the background of Islamic society.
Well, just because you're a practicing Muslim doesn't necessarily mean you can say who can and who can't come to this country.
No, I didn't say that, and that was not what you asked me, how do I think, so that's what I was raising to answer you.
Okay.
And that's the question. That is, the cultural context from which the population is coming is a cultural context that is in many ways antithetical to the values that represents a liberal democracy such as ours or in Western Europe. So the overarching issue is that these numbers are challenging our own system of a culture. Liberal democracy is a culture. I don't think that too many of us talk about this. I'm here talking about this as a political philosopher and academic, sir, so I'm sharing with you my concern. We are a culture, a liberal democracy, and that culture is based upon certain very fundamental assumptions. And those assumptions are unique in history. And the critical core assumption is about individual freedom. Now, there are cultures, in fact, most of the cultures around the world are not liberal democratic.
Agreed. But you make one assumption, and that is the big core assumption that you make in your philosophical argument, at least from my perspective, is that you're assuming that our liberal democracy, what it is to be Canadian, cannot withstand the input from the Muslim community from around the world. I would argue that the reason we are so good as a country and why 1 billion out of 7 billion people want to come here is because and I guess this is where you and I fundamentally disagree, and that is that we actually have a core belief, a core understanding of what it is to be Canadian, and there are 1 billion people around this world that seek to entertain that same kind of lifestyle, that same kind of belief, that same kind of democracy, that same kind of charter and rights of freedoms that we enjoy here.
Have I the time to reply?
Yes, you do.
Well, you're speaking to one of them sitting right across from you, sir. So I don't know whether you know the other side from where the demand comes. I know it from the other side. And I know, and that's why I said in my conclusion, I know what the opposite is, and why I so greatly value what is Canada and what I greatly value liberal democracy.
That's the dichotomy for me, because you are saying that others don't have the ability to become the Canadians as we see it, but you have that ability to do so.
No, I say it because it is a question of where we have gone in the last 40 years. In 2011, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the official policy of multiculturalism. I've written a book about it, and I would invite you to read that book, sir.
I do share some of your views on multiculturalism.
Yeah, right.
We don't share the same view.
No, maybe not, but that's what liberal democracy is all about.
That's why you
invite me and to share that view. So
absolutely.
It is not about that you impose one value and I impose another value. That's precisely the debate is.
Your concern is, though, that the Muslim community is going to impose a value structure and system here that will overreach, overarch, and overtake ours.
Well, I would argue that we have to be ostriches not to realize what is happening around the world. And we have to be ostriches that we do not understand that the demands coming from the organized Muslim community is for values to be accepted in a liberal democracy that is thoroughly incompatible with liberal democracy. I'm referring here to the demands of the Sharia implementation. We came very close to having that implemented or opened up in Ontario. We're seeing that's what's happening in Europe. This is not simply an isolated thing. And as I pointed out to you, sir, we might disagree on the issue, but this phenomena is a global phenomena that we are discussing globally. We're not only discussing within Canada. We cannot say that Canada is an island by itself and unto itself and is unaffected by the global phenomenon.
Thank you, Salim. Less than half a minute. And I know my other colleague is anxious to ask
Thank you, Chair. Salim, I want to focus a little bit back on the security of Canada's immigration system, and I understanding that if you look further ahead to the next generation, the multiculturalism side of it is how we social engineer our society. And, we've done that in the past, and since 1971 with multiculturalism, we are social engineering the future, essentially, Canada. What I want to focus on more is the cultural sensitivities that this study is.
I hate to do this to you, Mr. Lang, but we're at 7:08, and so if you could make your question very succinct. And
my question is succinct. My surname can be pronounced and translated in about 8 different ways. Muslim surnames could be Muhammad. My question to you is, how do we blend that into our system so that we can have the security of our system so that we know that the person that is coming in can be uniquely identified such that if he's a terrorist or someone that has committed war crimes, we will know about it.
Could you please keep your answer very brief, as we have gone well over the time for this segment. Very brief.
Well, very briefly, sir, my answer would be that liberal democracy respects individual rights. Your problem of how the names are pronounced is a problem of part of learning process. But liberal democracy's core value is the defense of individual rights, respect for individual rights, and counter to liberal democracy is group and collective understanding and rights. And that's where the fundamental conflict is, sir.
Okay. We're now going to proceed over to my colleague, Mylene Freeman, and welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Mansour, I'm not quite understanding how you're linking a policy of multiculturalism and openness and inclusion to security threats. Could you possibly try and draw that causal link for me? Because I'm seeing multiculturalism and inclusion as part of what liberal democratic values are and part of what this country is about, not the opposite. I don't think that it's I think rather the opposite. Policies of exclusion can breed intolerance. And could you please explain to me how you're making this link?
Well, I would very respectfully say that the problem that you're raising is particularly the problem that has come about in the last 40 years of bending the rules of liberal democracy, which is very respectful and inclusive of individuals, and to saying that, we're not going to say some things about others in the basis of their collective cultural values and rights. We have this problem right now in Quebec. I mean, if you're following what has happened there with their bill dealing with the question of hijab and niqab, this has been a huge problem in Europe. Now, is that a question of simply a cultural value, or there are security implications? We've had this debate here. I've appeared in the committee here talking about face uncovering for passport photographs and identities and so on and so forth. So that is part of the security issue if you're talking about it. I think our police forces and our security forces are daily running into problems. I've spoken to a lot of police officers. Some of them are my friends who deal with this problem on a daily basis. So yeah, there are cultural sensitivities here, and that is protected by the multicultural values. And so that's where the drift is and where the problem is, and which is where I'm putting my fingers on.
Well, I mean, you in an interview with Phyllis Chesler, Professor Phyllis Chesler, you say that when asked what you think Canada's immigration policy should be, you answer that it's a complicated subject, and quote, that my own view is there should be some sort of moratorium on immigration from the Muslim world, given the nature of politics and culture exported from there to the West. So what you're meaning is things that aren't compatible with liberal democracy, not actually Muslim culture, given that you are yourself Muslim. I assume that it isn't. It seems here like you're saying all Muslims will not be compatible in liberal democratic value systems, which I'd like you to explain or elaborate if that's your view, because unfortunately I just don't see how that is the case.
Honourable member, I can explain to you by analogy if the time permits. The people who understood what the problems of communism were people from within the belly of communism. If I remind you of names like Natan Sharansky and Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Václav Havel and others, this was a global struggle. And it was a struggle, which was, in a sense, a life and death struggle. And there were people inside the Soviet Union, as there are inside China, Liu Xiaobo and others, who understand what is at stake. So it is not that the whole Muslim world is completely driven underground. There's a huge struggle going on right now as I speak. But the problem and the challenge is that the organized mainstream Islam is incompatible with liberal democracy. And we as a society have decided not to question these things.
I think the member is
I would like to talk a little bit about, in this interview, you do talk about the fact that, for instance, in the Shafia case, these girls didn't have access to resources. I mean, isn't the problem really our giving access to these girls and making sure that they have safe spaces and places to get out of these situations like any other Canadian girl would, that are culturally appropriate, like that are Muslim, women's centers or something like that, somewhere where they can go and feel comfortable, just like we do that for Aboriginal women and needs to be done for Aboriginal women, and you know, girls like myself who, you know, have generations back in Canada, I still have friends like me who come under abuse as women. So this is something that's more about resources and not actually about Muslims. So if you could maybe talk about some of the resources we need for addressing these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I'm a father of a beautiful young girl, you know, and I hope she will grow up to be a very strong woman like yourself, madam, you know, and will have a role to play in Canada. And I want her to be that. I want her to be a free and brave woman. But I wouldn't like to see what has happened to a woman who wanted to be brave, and like any other Canadian, who was strangulated, like Aksa Parve. She just wanted to be a Canadian woman. And every aspect of what is Canada was ignored to Aksa Parvez, as it was ignored to the girls, the Shafila family, and there are innumerable such things. And that is the fundamental contradiction that we have brought upon ourselves. We have contorted our society. That's the Europeans are now facing up to it. And some of us will have to face up to it. Maybe you members are reluctant to face up to for all sorts of political consideration. And some of us have to speak out. So ironically, as a Muslim, I'm speaking out here, reminding you that this is a deep struggle that is going on. This is a 1400-year struggle. So when you tell me that this is not something to do about Islam or about Muslim, it's simply about the resources, well, that's a patchwork answer. Yes, we have symptoms, and so it's like an illness. You have to deal with it aspirin or with other medication. So yes, the resource center. But that doesn't answer the fundamental problem that we are importing into our country. I only raise the issue of Islam, but there is all sorts of other issues.
Right. So, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned, the Bouchard-Taylor report a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
In it, I mean, do you know the difference between basically secularism and laicity that Charles Taylor will draw? So maybe give a quick explanation of that for the committee. I don't know how much time I have.
You have about 32 seconds to respond.
In that case, what I will go ahead and say is essentially that I think you're arguing for something that sounds a lot more like laicite to me, which is a lot more like what European countries have done that have led them to the situation of not being able to accept other communities. Whereas Canada has been struggling to obviously struggling, but I think succeeding in a sense, to create a secularism where everybody is included, and that means that we do need to bring out tensions, and we do need to make sure that in the end, I agree, liberal democracy needs to be withheld, women's rights need to be withheld, for instance, but that isn't something that I think is tied necessarily to shutting out communities or shutting them into themselves, but rather openness. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Freeman. And now I'm going to turn to Deputy Lamoureux.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate your comments. Don't necessarily have to agree with the comments, but I do appreciate the comments, and it does lead me to maybe a different line of questioning. And you're obviously very concerned about the multicultural policy. It's very apparent. One of the things that the government does do beyond immigration is provide settlement monies. And through the settlement monies, there's a multitude of different types of programs that are provided. Do you think that if we were to look at settlement programming, and maybe this is something in which the government has not been overly successful at, is looking at settlement, how we're spending the settlement money, maybe to be able to deal with some of the concerns that you're highlighting here. If we look at the value of education and the education of tolerance in society, for example, of how we could better ensure that people are being provided opportunities in an equal fashion, do you think that we could be doing a better job in terms of settlement plans, which would make our communities a safer place to be?
So we can always do better job under any circumstance. That's not the issue that I'm concerned about. We were, until this policy of multiculturalism was introduced, a liberal democracy. We are still trying to be a liberal democracy, but we have created a situation And again, the Europeans are not confronting it. We have created a situation because the implicit premise of multiculturalism, that's the fundamental political philosophical issues we are dealing with. The fundamental premise of multiculturalism is collective identity because it says all cultures are equal, which is a flatly untrue statement. All cultures are not equal. You cannot equate a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is not a color issue, by the way. And I think that's where people get confused. Liberal democracy is a fundamental issue of premise that says about individual rights. And historically, a liberal democratic system has best dealt with all the various contradictions in bringing about a good society. So we can do and deal with all of the problems that arises by eliminating this argument that we have imported into our own makeup as a society that all cultures are equal. That leads to all sorts of consequences. Time forbids me, but that's why I said history is a paradox. And you take and consider any situation, it is the unintended consequences that flow. So I would remind you, and I've written about this extensively, that our Prime Minister, late Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, right in these hallowed halls, in his last visit, expressed regrets. When he was asked a direct question, what do you think as a father of official multiculturalism? What is your thoughts about multiculturalism that you introduced? So these are footnotes that you can go in through it. The paradoxical result has been we have been stripping away the fundamental right that exists in a liberal democracy, and no right is more fundamental than the right of free speech. And we have contorted and created all sorts of problems. And we're going to make it even more as the numbers grows, because that's our political institution under this system will try to adapt to those numbers, will try to accommodate those numbers, will then give in to those numbers. That's the nature of politics. It is nothing new that we are inventing, especially a democratic politics. It's all about numbers. That's what I said. And so the numbers are going to lead to a certain way things are going to evolve. And we are already seeing the signs of that evolution taking place. The problem with the Islamic world has been the global challenge that has come into it at the beginning of the 21st century with 9/11. And it's not going to phase out so quickly because it's a historical challenge, just as the challenge with communism was all of the 20th century. So when you raise the question about expenditure and maintenance and health care and so on and so forth, we will need those resources. We will need those monies. We will need to keep an economy growing. I'm coming back to the fundamental nature of our society. And there is that paradoxical relationship between where we are in terms of a multicultural society and a free country, an open country with the levels of immigration, the numbers. And the two things will reach within a matter of a generation to a circumstances which I'm inviting you, because we send you to represent us, that we are looking down a road. This is not a matter of hypothetical. This is a matter of clearly being able to forecast where we are headed. And we are headed into dangerous grounds. Yeah. Europe is already showing us where we are headed.
Just to, I guess maybe just to pick up on one quick point.
Sorry, Deputy Lamoureux, your time is up. Thank you. We're now going to go to Deputy Opitz.
So in terms of multiculturalism, I would also point out that Senator Paul Yuzik and Prime Minister Diefenbaker had a great deal to do with it at the time. But and this was a great discourse, but I think we need to re-vector on what the real discussion is here today, and it's security. Canadian security in our immigration system. And I'd like to talk to you about we have talked about earlier on incidents where somebody has arrived in this country multiple times, deported multiple times, come back, perform criminal acts, and so forth. And that's a hole in our security, clearly. And some of the biometric data that we'd like to put in place, including information sharing with our allies that will assist us in being able to identify those people that are undesirable in Canada or are actually coming here potentially to do harm to this country or for under fraudulent means. So I would like, and there are biometrics now. I mean, here's my Nexus card. This is I love this thing because you get in and out of the airport very, very quickly. You're identified. It's there. The retina scan, fingerprint scan, my photograph, which is really unflattering, but it's very useful. So I would like your thoughts on the security apparatus, the things that we need to put in place, as Mr. Menegakis earlier referred to as an entrance and exit strategy, so we know people coming in and out of Canada. So can you comment on those things, sir?
My comment is very briefly. We need the technological input that we can get and put them in place. The dilemma is, as the previous witnesses pointed out, the question about our legal obligation, our constitutional obligation to the individuals on the one side of the equation, and the other side of the equation is exactly as you have mentioned, the concern about our security, people who want to do us harm. That's quite evident. And how do we go about it? How do we balance those things? I would weigh in on the security side, given the nature of the world that we are living in and the nature of the threats that exist.
Yeah, I agreed, and I think that we need to be able to identify people categorically through photographs, the tombstone data, as they say, which is very, very useful. And in terms of information sharing, what is your view on terms of the databases that are shared? Should they be a 100% solution, or because I don't think there is. I mean, data is only as accurate as the inputs and is subject to correction, no matter where you are. What's your view on sharing data between allies, sir?
Well, it depends upon who you're sharing with. I mean, I think if you're going to be sharing with other democracies, we need to share with other democracies, and we will trust that and demand that they keep those data secure. But if you're sharing it with non-democracies, and much of the threats that we are talking about, which is below the surface, we don't want to, put them in words, are from areas which are non-democratic societies, and the problem will persist. How do we share those data with these non-democratic societies, knowing fully well that these are societies that have no respect for their own people? We're watching this on a daily basis, what is happening. So those are concerns. We as a democracy, we take our responsibility seriously, and we can only go so far as about our responsibility is, but the other side, it will be simply a matter of prudence and pragmatics.
Okay. I don't have much time left. So do I?
20 seconds.
Great. Now, would biometrics technology be enough here, or would other methods? So, for example, Israel, they use pre-screening methods to identify everybody that's boarding a plane before they depart or enter Israel via an Israeli airline. Is there something we can do? Should we implement similar procedures?
Well, the quick answer is this is the paradox. We put in a high technological instrument in place, and we assume that will solve a problem. The ultimate is the human intelligence. So the Israeli issue is also they have the most modern technology to the extent that I have traveled in Israel, but the human intelligence is also immensely good, and ultimately it's the human intelligence side that becomes in some ways a critical issue.
Just for the can you define human intelligence?
Well, the sources that we deal are security, people that can come and talk to you. Here I am sharing with you information, the information that we can provide. Our state and its people can reach out and keep tab upon the information that comes to. I think and the confidence that the people feel to come out and share the information. I don't have to tell you, sir, about, for instance, the way the Toronto 18 was cracked. And so many others have been cracked that we do not know about it because, again, the dog never barked. Mm-hmm. But the reason that the dog never barked because it was the human intelligence that prevented the dog from barking.
Right. Thank you.
My apologies. You actually have 2 more minutes.
I do?
Yeah.
Oh.
Gift.
Rick, good to go?
Yeah, I actually, that's an interesting observation. Our previous 2 witnesses, one in particular sitting in your chair, argued about the fact that by keeping all of the records that we do, we can't really prove whether we've actually kept somebody bad out. And I think you're actually presenting the other side of that argument, which is, it's very hard to judge who we may have kept out, because the last thing CSIS or for that matter in terms of a North American agreement with the United States, the acknowledgments publicly of those who we kept out are not necessarily those that we should make public. Right. And I think you're making a pretty strong argument that we do need, with respect to security, a certain semblance of order and specifics around what that intelligence collection is all about. So I guess just maybe giving you an opportunity to pursue that a little bit further in terms of acknowledging that, look, we need a system in place that is going to have its checks and balances in order to keep our country safe.
Yeah, I agree, sir. My time is up.
Oh, no, you got 30 seconds.
Yes. Well, keep it brief.
Well, I agree. I mean, we need to have the checks and balances in place. The human intelligence is extremely important, and we are all of us know that the demand side is far greater than the resource side available. So how do we cut the resources for all the demand that is out there?
Right. Thank you very much. I'm now going over to Deputy Sitza-Bison.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Mr. Mansour, thank you for coming today. I, for one, believe that Canada's multiculturalism is something that Canada and Canadians take pride in. I represent one of Canada's most diverse ridings. It's something which constituents have told me time and again how much they value our multicultural heritage. Over 90% of my constituents are actually considered new immigrants or immigrant populations. Canada's multiculturalism supports feelings of pride, respect, and connection to one's culture and heritage, which, of course, furthers newer immigrants' sense of pride in their new home, Canada. Myself, I'm a Canadian of Tamil heritage. Like you said yourself, I'm not a hyphenated Canadian. I'm a Canadian, but I also value my heritage and feel that it adds a lot to myself, my identity, and what I will be leaving for my children, my grandchildren, and my community. I know that I've been able to make a little bit of a contribution and will continue to make much more because of that heritage that I understand and know and I'm proud of. Multiculturalism, it protects one's ability to act in accordance with one's cultural beliefs or practices, but of course within the limits of the law. We know some of the examples that my colleague mentioned earlier, that oppression exists within all cultures and countries. Racism, sexism, this is why we have laws to protect people in our country. With a history of discriminatory policies, like, of course, the residential schools or the Chinese head tax, exclusionary policies, I don't believe that, this is something that we should be doing. This is probably not the direction that we want to be heading in the future with further exclusionary policies or discriminatory policies with our immigration policies like the Chinese head tax. My question for you is relating to what many auditors general have mentioned. One after the other have stated that there are serious flaws with how our current immigration laws are administered. Officers have no idea who should be coming to Canada, as they do not have specific nor enough information to make an assessment on the admissibility of applicants. Additionally, there is a lack of performance reviews, guidance, and training that's provided to officers who are making these decisions. Do you have any comments on the Auditor General's recommendations?
No, I don't have any comments. I mean, your preliminary remarks I share with you, but we have different conclusions in terms of your preliminary remarks. You come from Sri Lanka, I was born in India. If there's any country that is more multicultural, if you want to talk about it, it is India, with 1 billion people and its diversity, but we talk about
Sure.
So the point, I said the preliminary remarks. Mm-hmm. On the second report, it's an ongoing problem. It's an ongoing problem of our bureaucracy. It's an ongoing problem of our institution, because we are a multicultural society, and the people who are going to man those systems are constantly going to be facing the dilemma of how do they adjudicate between the people coming in and how to keep the country secure.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt if I may,
sorry,
just because
please.
I have 1.5 minutes left or something.
okay.
The question was directly about the Auditor General's recommendations, because this is a study on security and with respect to immigration policy. So you don't have anything really to add to that. So I'm going to move on, if I may. So my second question is that individuals from countries all over the world have resettled here in Canada, like yourself and myself. New Canadians I believe, are an integral part to the prosperity of our country and our communities, and their contributions to success of communities like Scarborough, where I live and represent, are vast and wide-reaching. It's my belief that immigration is integral to our economy, both locally as well as our national economy, as well as the development of our communities. Would you agree to that?
Not necessarily.
Would you like to expand as to why not?
Well, I mean, the question is, again, how do we define our national interest? If you're talking about it, is it geared to economics, that immigration is necessary for the economic growth of it? Then what about when there are economic downturns, when there are serious economic problems? Are you, as a member and the Parliament, ready to also retrench the numbers?
Sorry, I know I have like 20 seconds. Statistics Canada actually says within the next 5 years or something, Canada is going to be dependent almost 100% on newer immigrants, on the labor shortages for the labor needs in this country. So are you saying that we should stop immigrants from coming into this country, and then we won't be able to fill the labor needs in this country?
Well, I mean, you're giving me a 30-second answer to a question, you know. I mean, these are all full of falsification issues. All these studies can be contradicted by other studies, so you're making a selective issue of one particular study. I can cite you Grubel and Grady study.
Thank you. We have a number of speakers yet. Okay, so over to Deputy James.
Madam Chair.
I'm practicing my French today.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you also to our guest, Salim Nasser. I'm going to tie this. We've kind of gotten off track a little bit during this session, and I wanted to speak specifically to what Canada is doing, what we can do better to screen people coming into Canada. And I'm just going to give you an example of one particular case where I think that our current asylum system has failed Canadians. And when I first read about this particular case, I was outraged. I'm just going to read it to you. It has to do with a gentleman named Mahmoud Mohammed Isaiah Mohammed, who carried out terrorist acts with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Despite his connection to terrorism, he has been able to remain in Canada since 1987. And because of our current system, with the ability to seek judicial appeals on, I guess, deportations and so forth, he has actually cost Canadian taxpayers $3 million. Now, when I think about this case, I cannot think of a better example of how we, as a government, as a society, has failed the Canadian population, the Canadian taxpayers, and also really hindered the safety and security of our nation. So I just want to, we've got a little bit off track, but I'm just wondering what you can recommend to us, to the government, what we can do to correct the flaws in our current system for screening, how we can prevent this type of thing from happening again, how someone can be here since 1987 and still be fighting deportation.
Well, as a Canadian, I feel insulted. The people who have broken all sorts of laws are still, you know, living off the taxpayer portion. I am a taxpayer, just as I'm a Canadian, so I feel insulted. And I think a majority of Canadians would feel the same way. The quick and the short answer is that once the legal process had been exalted, he should have been deported.
Thank you. So when it comes to screening, I know that you've probably heard that we're implementing biometrics and things. Would you agree that biometrics would certainly help in a case like this if there was a known record on this gentleman? Certainly, once he leaves Canada, he wouldn't be allowed to come back in with biometrics.
I would hope so, but I mean, the place of origin of this gentleman, they wouldn't have the technology to put it on the biometrics, you know, and I think that is precisely the problem of what we're dealing with. The numbers, the source origin that have changed in terms of what was one time the pattern of immigration from Europe to now the pattern of immigration predominantly from the third world countries.
Thank you. With regards, because there's various different immigration streams for people who come into Canada, do you think one immigration stream over another poses more of a security threat? Do you see the ability for someone to come into Canada across the border through one immigration stream over another that would be leading to, a problem with security on a national level?
I do not fully understand what you mean by stream, but I mean the common sense tells us that there are sources of areas in the world, the source of origin, which are greatly problematic and does concern us in terms of the threat that they bring to Canada.
With regards to immigration stream, like I'm talking about coming here as an asylum claimant seeking refugee status versus someone who comes to Canada, gets permanent residency, and then applies for citizenship.
I agree with that, yes.
Okay. With regards to, and this is something that through the course of, I was just elected on May the 2nd of last year, so I've learned a whole lot of things about our immigration system that I didn't know actually occurred, and I was a little bit taken back at times. And one of the things has to do with the entry and exit of people who come to Canada and our ability to track who's coming in the door and who's leaving the door. And and again, who's coming in the side door, who's coming in the back door when they should be coming in the front door. So I'm just wondering what your recommendations would be to improve our ability as a nation, as a government that's concerned about security, how we can better track people coming in and out of Canada.
What amazes me that any regular bank would track me down any part of the world if I had defaulted on their payments.
It's true.
And here it is, we as a country cannot track down and keep a track on people who are willing to exploit our system.
How much time do I have left?
15 seconds.
I'm going to be very quick. Now, you've talked a lot about the Muslim population and so forth, but do you feel that it ties into the ability to integrate easily into Canadian society? Do you think that that's leading to some of the problems? And I'm not singling out any one particular group, but I'm just wondering if that's the key to a successful person coming into Canada, really contributing, getting a job, and getting the most out of Canadian citizenship as well. Do you think easy integration is the key?
Madam,
Could you just hold on for a second, please? Unfortunately, we've gone well over. It's 5 minutes and 15 seconds. So if Mr. Deputy Manigakis is next. So if he would accommodate and answer, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll ask my colleague to finish her thought, and then I'll continue on after her.
Thank you. I think it was just your answer that we were waiting for, whether you think easier or better integration in Canadian society quicker, having the language skills, et cetera, is that key to success?
Well, a very quick answer. We are generalizing. So, in terms of generalizing, yes, there's a huge problem of culture and history that we are dealing with when it comes to immigration from Muslim countries into adapting in a society like Canada.
Thank you. I won't take up any more of your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, and thank you for your testimony before us today and for being here. I think you answered the first couple of questions that I had. Is it fair to say that you are supportive of the ETA, the Electronic Travel Authorization, and biometrics? I think I heard you say that you thought that these technological tools, if you will, can assist us in identifying people before they come into the country. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
Thank you. Canada welcomes a record number of immigrants every year. Last year, I believe we welcomed about 265,000. If I'm not mistaken, over the last 5-year period, we've averaged about 253,000 per year. A previous witness pointed out to this committee these high levels creates pressure to meet our targets. As a result, few immigrants are interviewed before obtaining visas to enter into Canada. We have heard testimony in the past that the lack of staff is not the problem, nor is the increasing the number of staff a solution. What do you recommend the government do to remedy this issue? Should Canada move towards more interviews as a method of screening applicants?
Well,
we have 1 minute, so letting you know.
I just started. Okay. No problem.
Well, we need more of it, and I understand that we are cutting back on our border security forces, so they're the problem of trying to match our economic resources to the needs. And simple economic 101, our needs are greater than what we can supply them with.
Yeah, although since we're running out of time, I will tell you this, that when the RCMP and CBSA and CSIS officials spoke with us, when they were witnesses to this committee, they're highly supportive of these electronic tools, particularly biometrics, that they identify as a 21st century tool.
Yes.
So I think that, in addition with interviewing process, gives the right tools to determine who the people are that are going to walk the streets beside our families.
I agree with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Salim, for coming to present to the committee, and thanks to all the deputies, and merci beaucoup, and have a wonderful evening.